Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pearce. This is a Ukraine war news update, first part thereof for the 7th of July 2025. We're going to go through the Ukrainian general staff figures for the Russian losses for the day before, all the usual caveats apply. You can find them linked in the description to the video below. 1,100 personnel lost is fairly typical for the time at the moment. 3 tanks and 7 AFVs likewise below the daily average in those categories, but that is, as mentioned, fairly typical. 33 artillery systems, about 1.5 times the daily average, so that's okay. 2 multiple launch rocket systems. Good to see a couple of them on the list, and 118 vehicles and fuel tanks, over 100 there, with 2 pieces of special equipment included. So fairly typical numbers for what we have seen over the last 10 days, 2 weeks or so. Something to mention concerning losses of troops. Russians write about their losses during operations in Kharkiv and the Kursk region. So Kharkiv was this area on the Dnipro River, sort of diagonally opposite Kherson, where the Ukrainians had a foothold for some time. And I suggest that they were used in the end. It might have originally been a case of trying to get a foothold to move across the river in a meaningful way, but that seemed not to be plausible. But they ended up staying there for an awful long time. The reason why I think they stayed there, and the soldiers might not have liked this, and there were soldiers saying, I don't know what we're doing here, this is suicide. But it may have been an element of that to a degree, where they were used as bait to bring in huge numbers of Russian troops and materiel for then the Birds of Magyar and others to absolutely hammer the crap out of those, including the 810th Naval Infantry Brigade. And the Russians in Kharkiv lost phenomenal numbers of troops and phenomenal amounts of equipment. Like, the equipment that was attrited there was stupendous. So you could argue that those people, while on the ground, might have thought, what are we doing here? This is suicide. Actually, from an overall point of view, from the commanders, it might well have been that these were kind of used suicidally as troops, but it used to bait in the Russians, and the overall calculation was very much in favor of the Ukrainians. Now, you're not going to like that if you're one of the people sent in to do that and sacrifice your life for the loss of Russian equipment and personnel, but I think that's essentially what may well have happened. And then up in Kursk, of course, the 810th were moved from Kharkiv, where they'd had an absolute pasting, taken up to Kursk, like the 155th Naval Infantry Brigade, and both of these, although there were some initial successes, they ended up getting tonked up there. So here we have someone saying, we were walking around Sevastopol and met a soldier from the 810th Marine Brigade. According to the Marine, 440 people entered Kharkiv, 200 left. So that is around about half of their unit killed there, I presume killed. And of course, that was one of many units operating in that area. So you add all these other units and you get, much larger casualty numbers. 500 people entered Kursk, 40 left. I mean, that is an absolute decimation of those troops in that area. So if that's true, and it fits in with all the other data that we have from the 810th in those two areas, then that is just, is reflective of the huge losses that the Russians have been making and taking over the course of the war. Now, there are these videos that have come out, and it's highly controversial. More and more videos are starting to surface, says Max25, of Russian deserters being chained to a leash and forced to go on an assault. So there's this form of kind of slavery, meat assault slavery, where deserters have been caught, then they're leashed up together, and then they're sent into the meat assault in a way that, doesn't allow them to run away individually or act individually. Now, many more videos coming out of motorcycle assaults. I did a separate video on this yesterday. This is a Russian motorcycle assault where the troops attempted to gain a foothold on the outskirts of a village. They dismounted and took cover nearby vegetation. Despite their efforts, the assault group was eliminated by drone operators from Ukraine's 60th Brigade. So lots of imagery of motorcycles being used in assaults, not always succeeding, but sometimes they do succeed, and that's why they keep using them, because they do convey an advantage. I talked about that in the video yesterday. Now, yesterday there was an aeroplane on the loss list, and I didn't quite know where it came from. just randomly turned up there. Not much was said yesterday in that context, but then we heard later on in the day that there was unconfirmed information about the destruction of a Russian strategic bomber, from which strikes were being carried out on Ukraine, according to a monitoring channel. So it might well be that another strategic bomber was hit in a drone strike. Indeed, there's a little bit of information on that potentially later here. We'll come to that later, but it could well be that another strategic bomb has been taken out. Now, here we've got a video of counter-battery strike. This is a Susanna 2. So if you don't know what a Susanna 2 is, it's a Slovakian-manufactured self-propelled howitzer that the Ukrainians have received a number of, sometimes funded by other nations. Pretty decent bit of kit being used by the Ukrainians. And here it's probable that the separate artillery brigade of the NGU, National Guards unit here, has, these guys using Susanna 2, probably got a greater range than the Russian artillery. And that's part of the problem here for the Russians, is that if they're using knackered barrels that are poorly maintained, and if the Ukrainians have an advantage in the maintenance of their artillery, and they just have better artillery anyway, more modern artillery, they operate a whole range, including their own D20s and 30s, older towed howitzers, L117s, and M777s. But then you're going up to Archers and Caesars and Susanna 2s, and their own, of course, Bogdana S222, S22, that have better range than much of what the Russians have, and you end up being able to do successful counter-battery strikes. So counter-battery being you are tracking you're tracking the shell in the air with radars. It don't have to be very big radars. Some of these TPQ-50s, ANTPQ-50s and whatnot, track the shell in the air, and then you can kind of reverse calculate where it came from. And then once you've got coordinates of where it came from by doing some physics with the trajectory, you can then strike the artillery. So you wait for the artillery to fire and then hit it. And that's why you talk about shoot and scoot. So you need to fire and then get your artillery out of there. But the problem with shoot and scoot these days is that the moving out there is what gets you spotted by drones. Now, drones have become more prevalent than counter-battery fire. But if you do have counter-battery fire, then, you've got a problem. If you stay, you get hit by counter-battery fire. And if you move, you get hit by drones. Now, if the Ukrainians have more counter-battery fire than the Russians, which I think they probably do, as in capabilities of tracking, the Russians have complained for an awful long time that they just don't have counter-battery. They've done that for ages. They did that actually down in Kharkiv to a large degree. There were complaints coming from there of having no counter-battery fire, no cover, etc., etc. Covering fire days. So if the Ukrainians can get a drone advantage and a counter-battery advantage, then that can be really meaningful. Of course, can they do that? Do they do that? Now here we have, talking about self-propelled guns, the Russian new self-propelled gun, the Malva, that I think came in 2023. Literally during a war, this thing came in, and we've seen a couple of them taken out. Actually, we haven't seen too many of these in action, but here's one that's just sat on a road, having had its cabin taken out by and it looks like it's got damage on the other side, on the offside. It depends which side of the vehicle you drive on, actually. But yeah, you can see at the front of it's knackered. So that's one of the Malvas. Then this footage came out yesterday. Lots of people talking about it. I don't quite know what's going on here, other than it looks like we've got a bomber drone, like not hovering, not quadcopter that hovers and then drops IEDs, but it's fixed wing. It's like a miniature bomber. It's like the modern version of the Lancaster or something like that. So Russian forces on the Kherson front are complaining about a new guest in the night sky, a Ukrainian high-speed unmanned bomber delivering precise strikes on their positions. Its flight was captured on a Russian thermal imaging camera. So let's go and have a look at this. You can see it's already dropped. Unfortunately, for this video, you missed like the main part of the bombing run. So it drops that bomb, and then it's getting out of dodge. I don't know whether those repeated flashes are from bombs going off, so whether there's multiple bombs or whether it's just the camera jigging around. Okay, so that could be something to watch out for. Again, the AASM French Hammer bombs, the guided glide bombs, being used to great effect. This is a strike on a building. You can see how devastating they are. And the good news here is the French are working hard. I think they're piling in $128 million or euros to accelerate the production of these. They're just bringing out a new longer range version. I would love it if Ukraine was getting their hands on these, and you could certainly imagine they would get their hands on these because this war is a big advertising opportunity for these arms manufacturers. And actually, if I was a foreign, particularly if I was already using, say, Rafale and Mirages, if I was a foreign nation looking at what's working in this war, the AASM Hammer does look pretty decent, although it's fairly costly, but that's because it has a rocket propulsion to it. So it's not just the guided glide bomb, the dumb munition that drops like the GBUs or the the JDAMs or the Russian carbs and whatnot. This actually has some propulsion on it as well, and it's being used so effectively. I mean, I don't like to be happy about massive destruction. It's kind of counter to my nature, but there's something oddly satisfying when I look at a Russian command post get absolutely shellacked. Oh, of course, absolutely shellacked by a guided glide bomb. So yeah, being used effectively there. Now, we heard yesterday that Kyiv, a power station, a CHP, so a combined heat and power plant, the TEC6 in Kyiv, according to the mayor, Vitaly Klitschko, was on fire. A tank with fuel and lubricants exploded in the hangar of a commercial enterprise near the power plant. But I think there was some power that was cut to Kyiv. I don't know if that's sabotage or something dodge going on there. Dniprovsky district in Kyiv partially without electricity after an explosion at the TEC6, although Klitschko saying it happened nearby, so who knows, that could be just a bit of PR to distract away from an issue with the actual power plant, which is more of a worry for those in Kyiv. Now, some Visionaire reported yesterday that in the Belgorod region, a Russian officer was killed inside his moving vehicle on the road. He's accused of participating in war crimes in Ukraine. You get this quite a bit, actual sort of retribution for horrific war crimes. They know a lot of the people who carried out war crimes in, say, Bucha and places like that, and they hunt after them. They are not happy that Ukraine is, as you can well imagine. Now, on the flip side, the Russians they're not going for military targets, particularly with a lot of their strikes at the moment. As Tim White says, the psychopathic war criminals are addicted to terror. Now Russians attack crop pickers in the fields of Kherson. This is yet again another freaking war crime. War crime after war crime after war crime. If you meet anyone that is defending the Russians and what they're doing in this war, you need to put them straight. They are morally, well, either they're massively mistaken or they are moral monsters. The Russians are operating on a different moral calculus than the Ukrainians. The Russians are here attacking crop pickers in the fields of Kherson. An anguished mother shouts, "The drone is flying at the car, run, run." And by the way, one of the few people I've heard use Ukrainian language in an emergency in Kherson, which is interesting. But yeah, crop pickers being targeted by drones. Here we have a kid, a family, obviously doing a bit of summer work or something, I don't know. But yeah, drones on the lookout. And if that wasn't bad enough that you get crop pickers being targeted by FPV drones, here we have an FPV drone hit and I showed you some imagery of fire engines after they had been hit over the last few days. This is I'm not sure where this is. It could have been the one in Kherson. But anyway, Russians bring out these videos with music as if this is all really cool. Yay, look at us. Again, this is a war crime. That is a war crime. You have an emergency services vehicle at a fire engine, obviously a fire engine. This drone operator knows that's a fire engine. You can see it's a fire engine. It's bright and red, and it's been called out to probably do some work on a petrol station that was hit, which arguably could be seen as a war crime. And then they're double tapping the emergency services. That is a war crime. And if you weren't convinced that the Russians, were moral monsters, and I'm not going to show you the video here, but I can't tell whether this is a pelican or actually it says pelican here, but it might be a stork. The endangered, protected species, migratory bird, very particular to Ukraine. It's either a pelican or a stork. Russian drone operators killed a pelican flying over Ukraine, listed as a rare species in the Red Book for fun. Absolutely sick people. So for no reason other than it's just sickening. There's something, I don't know. There's something psychopathic about that. Just to hover over a majestic bird, a huge bird like that, and just kill it on purpose. Just disgusting. So we go on. Strikes, distant strikes. Last night was a night of over 100 drones and missiles being sent into Ukraine. Again, I'd say a heavy night, but it's arguably not in the context of 550 munitions being sent less than a week ago. This is a fifth of that, less than a fifth of that. So during the night of July the 6th and 7th, Russia launched 101 Shahed type drones and other strike drones, along with 4 S-300, S-400 surface-to-air missiles used in the ground attack mode. They did that last night. 4 last night. None of them were taken down. 2 nights ago. 4 were sent and not taken down. I didn't know where they were sent from, but here I did say it's probably the northern oblasts because they don't have the range of, say, a Kyiv. They're not air launched. These are launched from the ground, so they have far less of a range. So it's going to be Belgorod. They traditionally used to be launched from Belgorod at Kharkiv. This could be Kursk region into Sumy. So 4 of those sent. Ukrainian air defense neutralized 75 drones out of the 105. 58 were shot down, 17 jammed. Far more being shot down at the moment than being jammed. Probably interceptor drones being pretty useful at the moment. But that still allows for almost 30 drones to get through, causing huge amounts of damage, no doubt. Now, when we look at, this is a real sidebar here, but sometimes I forget this and then think about it and go, oh yeah. Like sometimes we have a skewed understanding of how the map looks in the world, and this can affect how we understand Russia. So Russia is a massive country at the top of the globe. But when you represent a sphere on a 2D map, we can get our perceptions really distorted. So when you think about, the globe in the middle here is, that distance, that circumference around the middle of a globe is very different from the circumference at nearer the top of the globe, right? That distance is shorter, obviously shorter, just going that small circle around there compared to the large circle around the middle. But of course, on a 2D map, that small circle at the top is the same length as the large circle in the middle on a 2D map. And that makes a bit of a problem. So you can see that being represented by this video as you see the top of the map get distorted. It gets, the Mercator projection of a globe distorts it top to bottom and left to right. So you have to expand areas at the top and at the bottom in order to have it on the same in the same projection as the middle of the map, right? And that makes countries at the top seem much bigger than they really are. And Russia is a very good example of this, right? So you've got Russia up there. It is a massive country, isn't it? But and it still is a massive country, but when we take it down to the equator, it's far, far smaller. So the real size of Russia compared, what we really should be doing is taking all countries and then putting them down on the equator. So the US looks a lot smaller than it is. It's kind of halfway up there. When you move the US up to the top of the map, of course, it looks massive. Same can be said of Greenland. So Greenland is famously like this huge island, and it is a big island. You know, it doesn't stop being big. It's just not quite as big as you thought it was when you take it down to the middle of the world. In fact, it's far smaller than Brazil. Okay, and it's kind of the size of like Libya or something, you know, Algeria maybe. Our perceptions are distorted by the Mercator projection of the map. And so when we look at Russia and think, goodness me, those missiles that are flying, all those drones that are flying all the way over to there, you know, from over here to there, you think it's, and it is, you know, 1,000 kilometers is 1,000 kilometers, but actually, you know, relative to other countries in the world, our perception is perhaps distorted. So just I thought I'd throw that out there, remind ourselves, because we kind of, most of us will know that, but then we kind of forget that. Okay, random sidebar. So going to the strikes in Ukraine, Odessa was hit, Kyiv, Kharkiv, and a few other places this morning. Here we have Odessa on fire. Yeah, another typical night for the Ukrainians. And this morning, a Russian drone struck a residential building in Kharkiv, injuring 27 people, according to the mayor Terekov. Overnight, drone and missile attacks also hit Kyiv, Sumy, and Odessa. So Sumy's probably where those S-300s hit. As I mentioned, damaging infrastructure, killing at least 3 people and leaving hundreds without hot water. And it seems like, and look, there's another drone just coming down. Bang. You know, the terminal phase of the drone as it slams into, undoubtedly, thank you, Ivan, that's really kind, and the NAFO mug as well. Oh, this is amazing. Look at that. Cheers, everybody. As it slams in, oh, damn good cup of tea. Slams into residential areas. That is, you know, typical of the Russians, or at least it seems like that's a residential area. It might not be. In fact, we know that they are targeting very much at the moment recruitment centers. That seems to be target number one for the Russians. Anyway, we'll go to Zaporizhzhia first. A whole herd of drones has been attacking Zaporizhzhia this morning. 10 people have already been injured. There you can see a marketplace, and in the distance an explosion behind there somewhere. Meanwhile, in Kharkiv, residential areas have been hit. So another drone on its terminal phase. There's not a lot you can do about that drone when it's coming down at you at that kind of speed and angle. So there you go. Another drone smacking into, that is a residential area by all accounts. Now, first footage of the consequences of the Russian attack on Zaporizhzhia. The Russians hit the city with 6 Shaheds. Residential buildings, university building, enterprises of the regional center were damaged. So this is Zaporizhzhia, major city in the south, just getting hammered. The Russians are indiscriminate, it appears. Now, it looks like Russia has again targeted military recruitment centers in both Kharkiv and Zaporizhzhia this morning. Of course, they waited until the offices were open, and knowing that they are in densely populated areas, already 11 injuries have been reported, says Tim White. In Zaporizhzhia, among the buildings damaged is a university in the city. 3 military are among the 11 casualties in Zaporizhzhia, while 1 serviceman was injured in this morning's attack on Kharkiv, and that's likely to be from recruitment centers. A swarm of 6 drones smashed into Kharkiv within 10 minutes. 1 person is fighting for their life. The injury count is up to 7 now. There's massive damage to the Kolodnohirsky district. The roof of a building caught fire, and loads of houses and cars have been affected. Kramatorsk has also been hit on that semicircle of settlements behind Chasiv Yar, Druzhkivka, Konstantinivka, Druzhkivka, Kramatorsk, Slovyansk, Siversk eventually as well. A car wash is said to have been the place of the fire for the strike. More imagery from Kramatorsk. There are casualties there, unfortunately. Buildings and a tire shop are on fire. No further details at the moment. So really heavy mourning this morning. So it could be subsequent to those stats coming out that an awful lot of drones have been sent this morning. So Russia has intensified its campaign of strikes on Ukrainian military enlistment officers, says Wall Translated, hitting 5 such facilities over the past week. Following the latest attack, the enlistment centre in Vinnytsia has suspended operations at its main office and relocated key services. So that's interesting that Vinnytsia is moving it because they'd seen what's happened in Poltava and Kremenchuk. I showed you some images, some videos of Poltava and Kremenchuk of the buildings once they'd been on fire, and then actually in, I think, the Poltava case, the drone smacking into the building. You could see it. A pretty horrific video coming from there. This is Kharkiv and Zaporizhzhia coming under heavy attack this morning. Probably recruitment offices being targeted there too. And here we have, for the first time, Russians using a Gerber decoy drone. These are drones that are traditionally not used as strike drones. You send a load of these over with the Shaheeds, and that's why you quite often see on the stats decoy drones. So if you come back to here, this is electronic warfare and decoy drones. Quite often the Gerber is a drone that's sent as a decoy, but now they are so previously deployed solely to locate air defenses. The drone has now been repurposed to hit a civilian target. So there it smacks into, oh, let's have a look. Oh yeah, a residential apartment block. So the Chinese consulate in Odessa was damaged by a Russian drone the other day that contained components made in China. These components were manufactured in China less than 2 weeks ago and already used in an attack on Ukraine. What are the Chinese going to do about that, I wonder? Probably nothing. Now, we hear that last night, it might have been, an unsuccessful launch of the Ureshnik took place. It was carried out from Crimea towards Odessa. About halfway through the flight, the rocket lost stability. Something happened to the stabilization and it fell into the sea. The launch was observed by Crimeans and the fall of the rocket was filmed in Odessa. The weapon, although formidable, is still new and experimental. Hence this happening. Well, actually, some argue that it's not that new and it's not that different from was it the RN-23 or something like that. Yeah, it might not be as new and funky as people really think it is. Now, David D says the Ureshnik launched, it failed over Crimea. That's ICBM, Intercontinental Ballistic Missile fail. Number 7 for Russia, if anyone is keeping track. So this has a pretty poor track record at the moment. Remember, they sent one without its submunitions loaded into Dnipro, and that was somewhat successful. Well, that was a shot across the Ukrainian bow in response, I think, to the Americans allowing. So the North Koreans got involved. Then Biden said you can use ATACMS and American munitions into Russia to strike military targets. And then Ukraine did that. And then I think the response to that, I could be wrong, but I think the response to that was the Ureshnik being sent into Dnipro, but it didn't have its sub-munitions loaded. At least they didn't have munitions on them. They did fire them out, but they were without munitions. They would have had some kinetic impact. But other than that, the Ureshnik, I think, has been a bit of a failure and it keeps kind of having issues. So that's what David D is referring to there. Ukraine's drones have had a successful night hunting in Moscow region, says Tim White. The Krasnozadvozhsk chemical plant has been hit 6 months after the good Dr. 1 drone last came a-calling. Factory produces explosives, gunpowder and components for ammunition and missiles. So there is a bit of smoke and an explosion in the background to this video. Some report says many as 7 explosions were heard in the Krasnozadvozhsk plant. It's northeast of the Moscow city, quite near Sergiev Posad, which Ukraine hit just a few days back. That substation and another plant that was affected. And actually this chemical plant is apparently a massive employer. It's the biggest employer in the area. So this is a major facility. Quite what damage has been done to it. I mean, reports of 6 or 7 explosions. I don't know if there's anything else from that thread, so we'll go on. In the early morning, drones attacked Krasnozadovsk. Here's Max 25 says chemical plant is 540 kilometers from the Ukrainian border. The enterprise modernizes various MLRS, multiple launch rocket systems, produces cartridges, pyrotechnics, infantry flamethrowers. So it is evidently a pretty decent military target. So what else? Locals report 7 explosions there. As you can see in this video, fairly sizable explosion seems to have taken place in the distance there. Okay, then other than that, I don't know too much about what happened last night. There's still a lack of information about what happened the night before, particularly in Novorossiysk, where the Black Sea Fleet is now housed. That was attacked by a lot of unmanned surface vehicles. We don't really have any battle damage assessment. New analysis from Zaporizhzhia suggested the attack on July the 5th, so 2 nights ago, a strike on Borisovglebsk air base, it might be 3 nights, it might be the 4th into the 5th, caused prolonged fires lasting over 24 hours. Satellite data indicates damage to fuel tanks and possible UMPK guided bomb components. The base hosts Su-34 jets used in airstrikes. So a successful strike on Borisovglebsk, which we knew had happened, or at least we knew the strike had happened. Still, even with that, still unsure as to the exact damage done, but some damage there. And as mentioned earlier, according to unconfirmed reports, another Russian strategic bomber was destroyed today as a result of a Ukrainian drone strike, today being yesterday. And that's really significant. I don't know what, but I know there's a picture of one of them there. It's at the Tu-160, but we don't know what was actually hit. British Storm Shadow, but that could be that one that was on the list yesterday, of course. Here's an image of a British Storm Shadow cruise missile mounted under a Ukrainian Su-24 bomber. Long-range precision strike capability remains active in Ukraine's arsenal. Don't know what it says there. If I was on Chrome, I could Google Lens that and translate it. But anyway, that's good to see, because this appears to be a new photo. I don't think this is a photo dated from a year or two ago. So this appears to indicate that the Ukrainians, as we've seen from the use of these recently, they do have them. And I was thinking that they'd run out of Storm Shadow. So whether they have received more from the UK, maybe Scalp-PGs from France and or Italy, I'm not sure, but good news that they are using them. Now, moving on to other bits and pieces. Russia is moving over 20 trucks with personnel, as can be seen from this picture, from the occupied Zaporizhzhia region to reinforce its forces in the Sumy region. So that's interesting. If it's true, there was all this talk about the Russians mounting an offensive in Zaporizhzhia. If they're moving troops from Zaporizhzhia to Sumy, it means that the Ukrainians have possibly scuppered the Russians' chances of a big offensive in Zaporizhzhia, or at least it's going to be smaller than it originally was because they're moving troops from there. And it also indicates that Sumy is a place of some success for the Ukrainians. So the column includes Rodzgvardia, and why that's significant is Rodzgvardia a lot of Rodzgvardia attacked in the initial February 2022 invasion. And that was because it was a special military operation at that point. It was not a military invasion. They were expecting to just overturn the government within 3 days and spend the rest of the time clearing up. And the clearing up was going to be done by Rodzgvardia, because these are like internal security services riot police people. So you sent them in their APCs to go and make sure that everyone in these towns and cities around Ukraine were being good little boys and girls, and they weren't causing any issues. Now that your government's been deposed and we put in a puppet government, you just quieten down everybody. So you had these riot police that were... But of course, within 3 days, it was obvious that they got stuck in all these different places, that the Ukrainians were actually putting up resistance. They weren't expecting that, and it became a war. Now, forward 3 years, if you're moving predominantly Rodzgvardia, or a column that includes Rodzgvardia units in Gazelle vans, and the personnel is mixed, including units from the Caucasus, then you've got issues with recruitment. You've got issues with not having enough regular armed forces personnel. You're using your riot police again. So I little things like that, if they are true, are, I think, indicative, and it's important to sort of have a little look at them. Now, here is some imagery. Russia's moving over 20 trucks and personnel likely to reinforce forces in the Sumy direction, says Petro Andriushchenko, the advisor to the mayor of Mariupol. The convoy is moving from the Zaporizhzhia front through Mariupol to Taganrog with Rodzgvardia, gazelles and buses. So again, not particularly heavy on the military transport there. Okay, going back to my breaking news piece yesterday on the Eco-Wizard ship that was potentially targeted by sabotage. Russians are considering sabotage as a potential cause for the explosion aboard an ammonia tanker Eco-Wizard in Ust-Luga. So it's just by the Estonian border in not far from St. Petersburg. Russians inspected the vessel with an underwater drone and discovered 2 breaches, each approximately 1 by 1.5 meters near the engine room at depths of 6 and 7 meters. Russians say that metal was bent inwards, indicating the blast may have originated from outside the tanker. EcoWizard was not inspected upon docking. Port personnel stated that the inspection was skipped due to adverse weather conditions. The explosion occurred during the early hours of July the 6th, while the tanker was being loaded with ammonia. Operations were halted immediately with approximately 3,500 tons of cargo already on board at the time of the incident. Russian governor of the Leningrad region says that there is no threat to human health or safety and that no environmental damage has been recorded. Now, it's not too ridiculous to think that you could get special forces from Estonia to Ust-Luga relatively easily and go and plant some limpet mines on all sorts of stuff. So, sabotage seems to be fairly plausible. It's certainly very possible. Okay. Russian airports cancelled nearly 300 flights amid drone attacks on Russia. Zaporizhzhia reported on the evening of the 6th, so that's last night, that 287 flights have been grounded across 3 major airports. Moscow's Sheremetyevo, St. Petersburg's Pulkovo, and Strigino Airport in Nizhny Novgorod. The real chaos taking place over the last 48 hours plus in Russia. The major disruption at the airports caused 287 flights to be cancelled. And of course, when you cancel a flight, it's not just that flight that you have a problem with. Then that flight can't do the next leg from there. And then it means you have chaos at that airport. And then, these cause domino effects when you have nightmares at airports. St. Petersburg faces internet outages. Delays for 100 more flights on top of the 287 cancelled. Payment failures, internet outages, delivery delays, and paralysed transport. Taxi prices have skyrocketed, and that's even if you can get one. And all these pictures of total chaos in the airports are commonplace at the moment. We've seen them a lot over the last couple of days. Now, this added to what's going on with the civil aviation industry anyway. Here's an example that came from yesterday. An AN-2 plane with passengers on board crashed in Transbaikalia, Russia. 9 people are in hospital, 3 of them in serious condition. Just lots of issues with air safety and planes, not least, not just the idea that you can't get planes to take off and land because airports are closed. Now, Putin has fired his transport minister, Roman Starovoyt, a former governor of Kursk, whose successor was arrested for embezzling funds meant for border defences. As a minister, Starovoyt failed to protect critical infrastructure from Ukrainian drone strikes and couldn't maintain stable air routes. I mean, goodness me, that's a difficult job, I would say, with all these drones flying around. Another one falls as corruption and incompetence plague Russia's war effort and so-called special operation, says War Translated there. Okay, moving on. To add to that, according to Russian media, the aviation collapse at Russian airports has just cost the Russian companies around $250 million. So these are only official and preliminary estimates, and there are probably all sorts of knock-on effects and costs as mentioned. Now, Zaporizhzhia reported that since July the 5th, so that's less than 2 days, airlines have cancelled 485 flights now. Wow, 485 flights, experienced nearly 2,000 flight delays for both departures and arrivals, issued 43,000 forced ticket refunds. So that's going to cost the industry, maybe the government, huge amounts. Diverted 88 flights to alternative airfields, provided hotel accommodations for 94,000 people. The disruptions hit Sheremetyevo Airport in Moscow, Pulkovo, St. Petersburg, and Nizhny Novgorod the hardest. As of the morning of the 7th, today, 40 flights were still delayed at Sheremetyevo. However, Zaporizhzhia claimed that the situation at the airport was calm. At Pulkovo, 104 flights remain delayed. 8 have already been cancelled today. In Nizhny Novgorod, 3 flights were delayed and 1 has been cancelled. So, real issues still with regard to the airport situation. And that is going to be hurting the Russian economy, as well as annoying people. And, some people are going to be blaming the Ukrainians. Some people might blame the Russians for starting this. Now, Trump was asked why he doesn't support Ukraine the same way he does Israel. His response, according to multiple sources, was essentially, and this is another interview by an airplane jet. Well, we're prioritizing stockpiles. He explained that Ukraine does need Patriot missiles, calling them amazingly effective, but noted those systems are hard to come by. So actually, there's more to be said about that chat that he had, that interview, because he said a few things. We'll do that in a geopolitical video. I just wanted to throw this one into this video because I think it's fascinating. So French aid to Ukraine here, reporting from Politico. Quoting from Politico, London and Paris have so far coordinated closely to try and keep Donald Trump in the room for Ukrainian peace talks. With progress stalled, British and French officials are letting slip some annoyance at how the other side has chosen to handle the mercurial US president. So as one French academic with links to Macron put it, the British premier is much more cautious. So Keir Starmer, much more cautious with Trump. Macron just wanting to be more, robust with his dealings when it comes to dealing with the White House. The same former British diplomat quoted above said Macron had, quote, done some stroking, but not as much as we have. So the British are stroking Trump much more, his ego, much more than the French. When it comes to Trump's ego, they described Starmer's softly strategy in dealing with the president as shameless but necessary. In other words, it's Mark Rutte at NATO. That's what the British are doing. Shameless stroking of Trump's ego, but it's necessary, they think. Macron has shown himself more willing to undercut Trump, visiting Greenland in a show of solidarity, and of course that pissed Trump off and probably was part of the cause of why he left the G7 early, and drawing the US president's ire by suggesting to reporters that Trump was leaving the G7 early to negotiate a ceasefire between Israel and Iran. Perhaps more seriously, there are also hints of tension in the pair's efforts to preserve Ukraine's ceasefire negotiations, and they're due to meet on the 10th to discuss coalition of the willing. Two French officials admitted there was a lack of direction for the coalition of the willing and suggested part of the problem was the importance given by the UK to security guarantees from the US. So we've heard this a lot from Starmer in the UK, that we will be doing coalition of the willing, but we need the backstop. We need the American air defense provision and whatnot, air support provision. But that's so far not materialized. It finishes here. So yeah, fascinating that Macron, and that fits in with his kind of Europe first, France first agenda in terms of, we need to be much more independent from the United States, so on and so forth. Now, this is pretty horrific. I won't play you the video of someone getting the absolute crap kicked out of them, but this fits in with what's going on in Russia at the moment. But actually, I imagine we'll come on to that in a bit. A gang hunting gay men has emerged in Novosibirsk. So local radicals in Novosibirsk have formed an anti-LGBTQ plus groups that deliberately seek out gay men or anyone perceived as gay, meaning anyone could be targeted, beat them up in the streets and post videos of the punishments on Telegram. One of the clips shows a thug assaulting a young man with dyed hair right in the city centre. Members of the gang openly state that they aim to re-educate their I'm not going to show you that, aim to re-educate their victims and threaten anyone who defends LGBTQ plus people, saying there will be consequences for anyone who protects these expletives. In Russia, LGBTQ plus identities have been officially labelled as extremist, and such attacks are taking place amid an escalating wave of state-sponsored homophobic hysteria. Now, what I want to just alert you to is that this is absolute fascism, essentially. You start off by kind of outruling protections for these people or positive work towards normalization. Now, in the US, that might be DEI. You get rid of DEI. That's your first step. The second step is then making it illegal, which is what Russia has done. And then they're now moving into the third step of enforcing that illegality. And then having vigilantes. So the fourth step would be vigilantes. So the law enforcement entities enforcing the law, right? And then vigilantes doing that. And then you have just society just completely discriminating against such people. And in this case, it's, gay men, but it could be X, Y, or Z, Jews, whatever. This is what happened in Germany in the 1930s, and then before you know it, you've got concentration camps full of people like this. And in fact, you had homosexuals in concentration camps during the 1940s. Now, I'm warning the US that they're going down that route of like, oh, look, let's just outlaw DEI, let's outlaw any kind of support and any kind of equalization of equalization of opportunity there for people of X and Y and Z groups. This is very dangerous, particularly, like, I don't want to go off on one. I've written articles on this before, right? I find homosexuality a really fascinating subject. With regard to, I've written about it with regard to religions, right? And so if you are, say, a god saying, well, this is wrong, and then you're the one responsible for the biology and the evolution of life on planet Earth, then it's a bit weird to say that's wrong when you look at how homosexuality manifests in, it's different for women. So I'm not going to talk about women here because there's a lot more cerebral influence on the determination of sexuality in women. But with men, it's largely, although not entirely, but largely biological, genetic and biological. So biological is different from genetic. So genetic influences are, in your genes. Biology can be in utero and things like that. So all sorts of, there's loads of fascinating research into this. Go and look it up. I've written articles on this that I'd love to point you towards, but all my articles are down at the moment. The point being that if you are punishing people on account of biological and genetic determination, then that's pretty horrific. That is completely unjustified from a moral point of view. And this is just bad news. I mean, this is another example of the overt growing fascism in Russia. It is just an ultra-nationalist, completely discriminatory society. Where there is pretense to traditional values. But then when you see that the US is trying to emulate some of this, and you had Trump and Putin saying to Trump on the phone call the other day, I think our traditional values, we should bring out some videos together and films and stuff to, talk about our shared, commonalities between us, our two countries in terms of our traditional values. Well, if this is where traditional values go, which is beating people up with dyed hair on the streets, and you've got Putin trying to say, oh yeah, we should work together on this, then, and you've got the Trump administration getting rid of DEI initiatives in that's that first step, then you can see that the US might be moving in that kind of general direction. So yeah, this is a bad signal for Russia for sure. Now, I've seen, moving on completely now, I've seen a bunch of these to the point where, and I haven't reported them, there's been a whole bunch of these that I haven't reported, and they are crashes of buses and coaches in Europe that have involved Ukrainians. And this one happened yesterday, and I'm like, this has got to be statistically significant now, to the point where does this need to be explained? So a bus carrying Ukrainian children crashes in Hungary. 21 are injured. 4 victims are reported serious condition, including 2 teenagers, 2 seniors. A bus was carrying a children's ensemble from Lviv to a dance festival in Ohrid. Now, this is like the 5th bus crash of Ukrainians I have seen in Europe. And I'm wondering if there's something going on there. There's a bit of sabotage or something. Might just be an anomaly. Right, just my consistent reminder to you that so many people on Twitter, amongst other social media platforms, are Russian trolls. Here's another great example. John Jackson, who's a good supporter of Ukraine, says, proof that any MAGA accounts on here are Russians, or many at least. I replied to a MAGA account, and then the dumbass replies from another fake account under a different name in the first person. The old forgot to respond from the right account mistake. Also, Thomas wants some love, folks. So this has happened an awful lot. In fact, it happened with not a Russian troll, but Joey. In fact, I'll find this for you. Now, though this isn't Russian influence, this is troll. This is troll influence. So Joey Manorino is a massive MAGA support. He's all over the Twitters and all. He's famous for casting his opinion. But he said this because he forgot to switch his accounts. So Joey Manorino, I reported this a couple of years ago. I'm a true black American woman, and I've been black all my life. I was born black and I will die black. My mummy black, my daddy black. I will never cast a ballot for that Kamala Harris woman as long as I live. Trump all the way, all day, every day. And he posted that under Joey Manorino, who's a white Trump supporter. And then he was absolutely castigated for that. And he because this was, and that picture there was his sock puppet account. So he had a picture of this black woman, was his other account that he was using to spread disinformation about, being a black woman that was never going to vote for Kamala Harris, and then spread. That's how trolls work online. But this guy's an American one, and he was called out for it, and it was delightful. But it also shows how insidious this is, and how it happens, so often. So that was Joey Manorino. But then here we have Russians doing it as well, pretending to be Americans. So John Jackson talks to American First Warrior, who says it's anecdotal, of course, but in the greater area of Odessa, I guess it seemed that about 75% in support of Russia. Of course, in Pridnestrovye, the Ukrainian support for Russia is about 95%. Says America First Warrior, who's so already like, you seem to be casting a lot of pro-Russian Ukrainian opinions and talking in detail about what percentage of people support Russia in particular Ukrainian areas. Anyway, but America First Warrior, sure. Then John Jackson said, "You've been there, have you?" And then the person replies to that tweet as the same person, but with a different name and a different avatar. So this person then becomes Thomas G.A. Jackson Nastrom, saying, "I have been. By listening to Ukrainians telling stories, Ukrainian men and women that John Jackson regards as cattle, experimental animals that deserve to be tortured. Shame on you. Liars will hopefully be punished when Russia, as humane as possible, has liberated Ukraine." So again, I presume this Thomas G.A. Jackson Nastrom, I don't know if this is an American or a Swedish, but whatever. But it's another non-Russian person. This is like total troll activity. So just be careful. They are all over the place. And we can have our ideas about how much support Ukraine and Russia have skewed by the fact that so many people are not who they claim to be. Okay, and I'm going to leave you on some good news. So, and this is not for the first time that Judas Priest, and I think, were they doing this with the Scorpions as well, who I think are supporters of Ukraine? Yeah, Scorpion's 60th anniversary. This is Rob Halford from Judas Priest coming out with a Ukraine flag on, and both bands are big supporters of Ukraine. So awesome stuff there. Love to see that. Slava Ukraini. Take care, everybody. All the best.